Okay, 11th and 12th grade, we're continuing chapter 26. We're talking about the Great Depression, the very beginnings of that. We talked about Herbert Hoover, who was the president right after or just before it started, the Great Depression. Some people demanded government bailout help. For the most part, Hoover was like, you know what, I think that actually should be along the lines of your local church, your families, and charities should be helping each other out, and that's not the responsibility of the federal government. That doesn't mean that everybody took that advice wisely. In fact, there were several men who just trudged across the country to Washington, D.C., and they set up what are called Hoovervilles, saying that they were demanding that the president help bail them out. Some of those men had actually left behind families to join these Hoovervilles, and they became known as hobos. These were men who abandoned families during the Depression. They rode freight trains from town to town. They lived in little outskirts of villages. But for the most part, families, churches, and local charities provided relief, and government assistance was unnecessary. Hoover was looking at this as, if we provide relief, then people are going to expect us to provide their everyday needs as well. And we don't really want to do that because we don't want people to become so dependent on government. Plus, it's just really hard to provide for everybody from one source. Remember that government money that gets handed out to the citizens of the United States is money that was paid to the government by the citizens of the United States. It's just recycling of money. He would rather see tax rates stay low and people using the money that they had already to take care of themselves than have to pay higher taxes and then depend on money from the government being given to them later. You're just being given your own money when you're getting government relief. Okay. During the 1930s, on top of everything else, a series of windstorms went through the Midwest, and there was really good reason for this. The primary reason was because the farmers were looking to make quick money, as fast money as they could. So they were planting crops that really weren't suited to the soil of the Midwest. And that was not entirely their fault. A lot of these people owned property they were sharecroppers, and they were living on property that they had rented from much larger corporations who were demanding that they plant certain stuff. The grass area of the Dust Bowl area that got affected in Oklahoma and Texas, primarily northern Texas, it would have been much more suitable for grazing cattle. But the companies who owned the land were pushing for things like, grow crops, which that compelled the farmers to plow up the land to plant the crops. Well, when the wind came through, it just blew all the topsoil away. So it was worthless. And this is a full-size house, but the dust has built up on the outside of it. So it looks like it's a little miniature house. That's a result of the dust storms. The posts in the front of the house, those are fence posts. So it gives you an idea of how much sand and dirt was actually flying around during these windstorms. It's pretty awful. Let's see. Okay. The American Red Cross provided relief for many farm families. When it was suggested by mostly newspapers that the charity use government funds, immediately the contributions to the Red Cross dried up. People said, oh, the government's going to take care of it. We don't have to give. And the Red Cross is not actually run by a government entity. They don't depend on government funds. They depend on individuals giving donations. And so as soon as this happened, the Red Cross said, government, step off. We don't want your help. We would rather go with private donations from individuals because honestly, they got a lot more from individuals providing. And it wasn't just funds that individuals were giving. Even now, people will give money to the Red Cross for certain disasters that happen, and they will give in the millions of dollars. Some people, if you have millions of dollars, but people also donate blood. People also donate their time. People also, they'll buy like cases of bottled water and send them to the Red Cross. So this is really an opportunity through the Red Cross, who's really just distributing a lot of these goods and making sure people are taken care of. It gives individuals in the United States, an opportunity to help their fellow man. So when it was suggested that the charity use government funds. There was a decline in private contributions. The Red Cross made a statement flat out, we are not accepting government funds. That is not us. That's not what we're doing. And we are not accepting, it's not happening. The people start giving back. Okay. Now, John Steinbeck was a novelist. He was very pro-socialist, but he's still a good writer. But the thing about Steinbeck, and I do like Steinbeck, and I have quite a few of his books in my collection, in my library. He writes so beautifully, but when his characters open their mouths, they speak like open sewers. They are very blunt, but they use some language that is just really reprehensible. Sometimes his descriptions of scenes, the way humans treat each other, is not always pleasant. But overall, I mean, he's considered a great American writer for a reason. I mean, he can really get into the heart and soul of what the lowest of American society would live like. So he wrote The Grapes of Wrath, which is an excellent book. Do I have it? Yep, there it is. I'm not going to grab it because I'd be out of frame anyway. But he wrote The Grapes of Wrath, and it described the plight of a farm family as they moved from Texas to California. It kind of cracks me up because I think your book says they were from Oklahoma. They're not. In fact, that's a running gag throughout the book that everybody calls them Okies when they get really offended by that. It's like, we're from Texas. What are you talking about? We're not Okies. So it's about this family that moves from Texas to California in search of work because they got pushed off their land. The land conglomerates that owned the property, these people are sharecroppers. The land conglomerate that owns the property is saying, we're not making a profit anymore because of the Dust Bowl. So we're just going to kick everybody off the land and we're going to start something new. And so people lost their homes that they had been living in for several generations even. And so frustrated, but they had to get off the land and they needed work and they were willing to work. That was really the big issue. So in The Grapes of Wrath, it really follows the Joad family as they travel and they are chased out of certain places. They're welcome in certain places. And there's even like a government campground where they're welcomed and they're safe. But really through it all, the main character is really pushing for this socialist ideal that if only the government would step in and take care of us would be okay. But then it turns out at the end of the book, he has a run-in with the government. So it's like, okay, John, what you trying to talk about here? But anyway, I can recommend the movie. The movie is really good and it sticks very close to the book's plot and characters. I mean, there are some that's, in and out, but for the most part, it stays very, very close to the plot. So I can strongly, strongly, strongly recommend the movie. And you can watch it with your parents and not be embarrassed. Okay? So go ahead and rent it if you want to. It's not required. This is just extra for you, but it's an excellent movie. I cannot suggest the book to you only because there is a lot of language in the book. Okay? So I wouldn't feel comfortable suggesting you read the book. If you choose to read the book on your own, go ahead, but I'm not going to suggest it. Fair enough? There's other John Steinbeck books you could actually read if you wanted to, but not that one. Well, most of his stuff is pretty out there. Let's see. The Pearl. I can strongly recommend you read that one. It's really good. It doesn't have any language, but it's got some scenes. Woo. Okay. Now, some people were looking at all of the disasters that were happening in the 1930s, and they wanted to create an even more of a crisis. There is an old saying in politics, never let a crisis go to waste. And this is really where you start to see this happening. This is propaganda being churned out by Washington, D.C. to create this crisis and making it more and more and more in your face. In fact, it becomes almost imaginary. So they want this imaginary crisis in order to move the country towards socialism. And the people who are really pushing this at this point are really the associations that are going to come out in the late 19th or mid to late 1930s. But a lot of photographers and writers like Steinbeck and magazine editors are really pushing for the socialist idea because they themselves were socialist. So let's talk about some of this propaganda here. This is a really cute little picture here, but this is a propaganda picture. The woman who's taking this picture, her name is Marion Post Walcott, went throughout the Ozarks, which is a very mountainous terrain area where people live very, very simply. And some people would look at it and go, wow, they're like really, really poor. Here's the thing though. Most of the people who lived in this area didn't see themselves as being really, really poor. They had gardens that they lived out of. They had chickens, usually. Sometimes they even had a cow. But what they didn't have is running water. They didn't have electricity, but they didn't see that as a necessity. They were fine using a pump and a well. They were fine using an outhouse. So they didn't see themselves as poor. And if you look at these children and the mom is dressed like any other homemaker in the United States at this time. In fact, if you look at her and the photographer, they're really not that different. They're wearing very similar shoes. They're dressed kind of the same, except for the photographer. She is in a skirt. Okay. And the mom is smiling. She's proud. She's proud of her kids. Because look at them. They're cutie patooties. They aren't starving. They got little round cheeks. They're dressed appropriately. But when this picture is taken, it is framed and presented in such a way of, look at our poor, poverty-stricken people in the Ozarks. Oh, we need to take care of them. The government needs to step in and help all these poor, poor people. It's exactly how it was presented. Now, at a time when the Depression is going on, the unions were really pushing for union strikes. And the reason for that was because, again, they were trying to get socialism to become a thing. Because in socialism, everybody has to belong to a union. The union is then controlled by the government. And so they were really pushing for the idea of socialism and for more union control over businesses. They looked at the business that somebody else started and owned as actually belonging to the workers, not to the person who put in the money, did the research and development, had to fill in all the forms, had to pay for all the different fees and everything. Instead, they said, no, the people who work there are the ones who actually own that property. That is not even remotely true. If we use the idea of a pencil factory, which somebody tried to do a gotcha moment with a conservative speaker at a college campus, and he said, well, the people who are actually making the pencils should own the pencil factory, because without me as a worker at a pencil factory, you wouldn't have any pencils to sell. And that the speaker turned it right around him and said, well, if it wasn't for me paying for the building, paying for the pencil lead, paying for the wood, paying for you to come in and work, I wouldn't have any pencils either. Okay, so it's really the person who is putting all that money in who is the owner of the factory. And they get a bigger paycheck because they have more responsibilities than the person who is just making sure the lead gets in the pencil. This is the opposite of what labor unions tend to teach. Labor unions tend to teach that the laborers, the workers, are the ones who should be running the show instead of the people who have actually put in the time and the money into the factory system. So when it comes to strikes and labor violence, the strikes hurt workers. They will tell the workers, we're going on strike to get you a better deal. We'll get you more pay. We'll get you fewer hours to work. So people will go on strike sometimes for days, sometimes weeks, and sometimes months. And then they get a raise in pay and everybody says, yay, we did it. And then the union will turn around and raise their dues. So they pay money to the union to encourage them to go on strike. Is that ridiculous or what? Saying because they believe that the union is there to protect them and help them. But really, they're paying an extra tax to that union to tell them what to do. And then when it comes to labor violence, say, for instance, your family's starving, you can't afford to be on strike, so you decide to go to work anyway. You are then considered a scab or a strike breaker, and they would feel free to beat you up. Violence is a huge part of the strike's ideal. Okay, people have been seriously injured, seriously hurt as a result of labor violence. Okay, that everything wasn't all bad during the Depression. I know we talk about the Depression and go, oh, it must have been horrible. But there were actually some good parts too. For instance, people would get together for get-togethers. Oh, they get together for get-togethers? It's great. People in families and neighborhoods would all get together during the Depression. Everybody would bring one thing. They do like a little potluck. This was really common. Now, I grew up with parents who were children during the Depression. So they grew up imitating what they saw during the Depression. So when I grew up, I saw my parents do a lot of this kind of same thing. It didn't occur to them really to go out to eat at a restaurant. I mean, when someone suggested it, my parents would be like, yeah, why don't we do that? But it never occurred to them on their own for the most part, especially my mom. My mom was very, very much a child of the Depression. But getting together as a family, that was all the time. In fact, if somebody was just traveling through your neck of the woods, as we call it, somebody's coming through your town, it was like, sure, you can stay at our place. You can, use our bathroom. You can sleep on our couch or on our floor, because we always had a pull-out couch. Yeah, of course you can stay with us. It was always, doors are always open no matter what the day or time. I am definitely not a child of the Depression, because I am an introvert as far as much as you can imagine an introvert could be. I could live all by myself in my little house and just be very fine. Okay. I like having the stress around though. I got to say that. But we were joking around today when this whole quarantine is done, I'm kind of going to miss it, because people are going to expect me to socialize again. And I'm just not ready for that. I really, really enjoy time alone. So family and neighborhood get-togethers. People would get together at the drop of a hat. They would get together for coffee. And if you didn't have coffee, chicory. And if you didn't have chicory, you could have tea. And if you didn't have, actual tea, you could grow some mint in your garden, because that stuff will grow anywhere. And you could use that. You could have mint tea. You could make little cookies. You could, whatever you had, you could share with your neighbors, your family, your friends. And you learned how to make things stretch. In fact, growing up, because again, daughter of a family who grew up in the Depression. Oh, goodness. There was no such thing as a throwaway day in the fridge. You ate everything. So we would have about once a month or so goulash, which is basically all the leftovers in the fridge that didn't get eaten up yet. And it just all went into one pot with some tomato sauce. Okay, that was goulash. Oh, and a bag of mixed frozen vegetables. Oh, gross. Okay, but people would get together. They learned how to stretch their food, and they exchanged things from their gardens. So that was a positive part. Radio programs, huge in the 1930s. If you've never had a chance to listen to some old-fashioned radio programs, you don't know what you're missing. Go on YouTube. They're on there. So look up 1930s radio programs and listen to a couple of them. Some of them are really, really funny. It's just like watching a TV show, but everything is done so that you could hear it. You can imagine it in your head. Monopoly came out during this time. It was kind of a protest board game. It's like, we're going to show everybody what those big bad banks are doing to us. But yeah, Monopoly became, the game you played when you were really confident that your family could handle it. It can be a dangerous game if you're at all short-tempered. Okay, or if you have a very short attention span. Monopoly is a long game, and people can get really vicious with Monopoly, but God bless, that's why I like games. So Monopoly came out in 1930s because it was what everybody was dealing with at the time. Band concerts. People would go to the parks, and maybe a group of people who just like to hang out with each other. They would each learn an instrument, and they would put on a concert in the park, and people who came to listen might throw a couple pennies into a hat or, a dime, and they'd split the take. But it was really they were there for just fellowship and enjoying the music. People would bring picnic baskets and eat and drink while they listened to the band, and it was a time to get together. So that was a good thing. Also, sporting events. Sporting events became huge during the Depression because people were looking to be entertained. And, sporting events were fun. I'm not a big fan of sporting events, but I grew up with a father who, he watched baseball on TV while listening to the game on the radio and looking at the scores and the box scores and everything in his newspaper all at the same time. So I understand when people like sports. Not me, though. Magazines, huge. We already talked a little bit about magazines, but yes, they were huge. And magazines were the place where you got short stories in the time and continued stories. People would write stories that continued month after month, and it would take you a whole year to get through the whole story. And then when the magazine was finished printing each couple of chapters every month, the publishers would pick it up and they would bind all of the chapters together and sell books, sell it in book form. A lot of our big writers started out as magazine writers. Baseball, like that's not a sporting event. Baseball became huge. It's very cheap to do baseball. It requires a stick and a ball and 4 things that you can have for bases. And then motion pictures became really big. For one thing, it was one of the only buildings that were air conditioned at the time were movie theaters. You think churches would have got right on the air conditioning, but no, it took them forever. Even when I was growing up, there were some churches. We used to go back east every summer, and it was like, people, invest in an air conditioner. It will not kill you. But it gets really cold here in the wintertime, and you're like, but you're not in wintertime. It's 90 degrees in here. But yeah, it took them a long time. But motion picture places, they understood the necessity of air conditioning. So people could go and spend just a fraction of a dollar. We're talking 25 cents at the most, 10 cents, 5 cents sometimes during a Saturday morning. You could go to the movie theater with a nickel and watch the newsreels, cartoons before the newsreels, and then a motion picture. And sometimes you could do a double feature. The reason for the inexpensiveness of the film was so that you'd buy the Cokes and the popcorn while you were there, because that's how movie theaters still make their money. But some of the big motion pictures that were around at the time in the 1930s, Gone with the Wind, was really big because it was full color. It was based on a very popular novel written by Margaret Mitchell, which I just finished. Last month, finished that. So everybody had read the book. They were looking forward to seeing what they do with the characters in Gone with the Wind. Mickey Mouse was huge. He was in all the shorts before the movies, so everybody got used to watching Mickey Mouse cartoons. Merry Melodies was big during that time. Also, Wizard of Oz came out in the 1930s, which you guys got to see. That's a good one. So really interesting stuff that happened as a result of people really wanting to entertain themselves. During the Depression, Christianity also had things that they wanted to do to bring people out. They knew people were looking for places to gather and to have some inexpensive entertainment. So revivals became a real thing. They started out with tent revivals. They would get huge, like circus tents almost, but usually they were just white. And revivalists would go from city to city or town to town area, little suburban areas, pitch a tent, have a week long of revivals, and then go on to the next thing. Camp meetings are where families actually went to one general place and they fellowshiped together. The kids got to play, the adults got to play, they played board games, they had sing-alongs. It was just like going to summer camp, but you went with your whole family and you went with everybody else's family too. Bible conferences were a lot like the camp meetings. But it was there, you were just really focused on studying the Word of God. And then churches started expanding their facilities because more and more people were they were investing more in their churches, looking at that as a place to gather. And so their facilities expanded to include mission boards, conference grounds, and camps. So a lot of churches had a campground. Maybe they had property that was donated to them, and then the whole church would just get into their cars and they'd go to this piece of property and they'd build a camp, and then people would rent camp spaces from them. My parents actually helped build several camps with their families. Okay, because the Great Depression created some hardships, but we always have hardships, but it did create a lot of hardships. Like 1 out of every 4 people was unemployed. That's a big hardship. But because the Great Depression created hardships, many people were willing to accept socialistic beliefs, the idea of government control and economic planning. And while we're on that subject, let's talk about this piece of propaganda that still pops up every once in a while to promote socialism. Still to this day, even though it has been so debunked. So let's talk about this. Okay. Dorothea Lange, photographer. She said, I'm going out, I'm looking for people who are working as pea pickers. That's literally what it is. People who are picking peas off of vines for grocery items. They're picking them so other people can buy them. Okay. Remember, this is a time when 1 out of every 4 people was unemployed. This migrant mom is married and has 3 children with her in this picture. You see them, all 3? It's hard to find that third one, huh? See the baby in her arms? There you go. Okay, so she is surrounded by her 3 children. Her husband is working elsewhere in the camp. This woman has been working all day. Her children have been helping her work. Her husband has been working all day. These are people who are employed. They are doing hard work, but it is work. And at the end of the day, they are getting paid for it. And they're getting food. And part of that food is peas. Okay, because that's kind of how that works. Dorothea Lange, we find out later from this lady and her family, Dorothea Lange approached this woman and asked if she could take her picture. The woman said no. She spent a long day picking peas. She has a family she's got to take care of. It's, a long day. And Dorothea Lange said, oh, please just let me take your picture. And the lady said, no, I really don't feel comfortable with you doing that. I don't want my picture taken. And Dorothea Lange wouldn't give up. She just kept pressuring and pressuring and pressuring. And finally, the migrant mom here said, okay, I'll tell you what, I will let you take a picture, but you have to swear to me that this will not ever get published. Okay, just take the picture and get out of my face. I've got stuff to do. I want you to promise me it will never be published. And Dorothea Lange said, I swear this will never, ever, ever be published. So she takes the picture and immediately publishes it in a magazine and says, this right here is a picture of what's going on in America. Look at this poor, poor woman raising these 3 children on her own, just, out of work, out of luck. No, she wasn't out of work. She wasn't out of luck, and she was married. You want to know the rest of the story? Dorothea Lange actually got awards for this, and she made a buttload, 116 gallons. She made a lot of money off of this picture. This woman got no money from this picture. Her family got no money from this picture. Her face was used to promote socialism. Her face was used as an example of great composition and photography. Her picture is in textbooks. Her picture is all over online. Her picture is everywhere. She never made a cent off this picture, but Dorothea Lange was rolling in it from this picture and lied through her teeth about this picture. She said, I did not approach the tents and shelters of others stranded, in other words, out of work, stranded pea pickers. It was not necessary. I knew I had recorded the essence of my assignment. The essence of her assignment was these poor people, we should rescue them. What ended up happening to this pea picking family? Well, they made it through the Depression intact. All their kids lived and stayed home with mom and dad. The marriage stayed intact. Mom and dad remained married. And they later purchased a home in Los Angeles. They worked hard and they were rewarded with a home of their own. They bought it themselves without government interference. Shocking. Dorothea Lange was a big old liar. Okay. Now, because of all of this propaganda about how socialism would be so much better, a man began to run for president using this idea of a socialist system. He called it the New Deal, and that man was Franklin Delano Roosevelt, our first really socialist president. He had a plan for economic recovery. He called for firm, aggressive action and relief for the average American, meaning government relief. The government will give you your money back, but we will tell you how to spend it, and we will give it to you only if you do certain things for us. Roosevelt also needed to get a little extra cash, and so he appealed to liquor sellers, and he promised to repeal prohibition and then promised their customers, I'll repeal prohibition for you if you will vote me in as president, give me some of that beer and wine cash that you've been selling, alcohol under the table. Give me some of that money and I will make sure that this gets repealed. Because it turns out Roosevelt at this time was governor of New York State, and he himself broke prohibition on the daily. He served beer and wine at his table and basically encouraged his children to partake as well. It infuriated his wife. It became an ongoing fight between Eleanor and Franklin. Wow, I forgot his name. Franklin Delano Roosevelt. The fact that he would openly serve alcohol at their table while governor of a state. He's breaking federal law as governor. And how did he get that liquor? He broke the law for that too, to get it in the first place. And she was angry at him for not only breaking that law very openly at their table as in the governor's mansion, but encouraging their children to partake as well. Because their children, even though they weren't babies, they were young teens, okay? And young adults. And she was not happy with him for that. Okay, we are going to stop right there. I think we got through quite a lot and we did really well. So I'll pick it up again on Thursday. I hope you have a really good night. Do a little bit of homework every night so it doesn't just, bury you. Talk to you later.